Now, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Michael Kim, professor at Yonsei University. Before I begin, I would briefly like to introduce him. Dr. Kim completed his undergraduate course in history at Dartmouth College in the United States, and subsequently he joined Harvard University, from where he received his MA and PhD degrees in the field of Korean history. He has been teaching at the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University for the last 7 years?
8 years.
8 years, for the last 8 years. And he has written several papers and also book chapters which were published in many internationally recognized journals. Now, some of the papers that he wrote, you can see here in the last page. For example, now the lost memories of empire and the Korean return from Manchuria, 1945 to 1950. So very interesting. The hidden impact of the 1931 post-One riots, credit risk, and the Chinese commercial network in colonial Korea. And literary production, circulating libraries, and private publishing. The popular reception of vernacular fiction text in the late 1990s. So his scholarly activities range from the late Joseon period to the contemporary post-liberation era. So he's a scholar of versatile interests, and we are very happy to have you here to talk about the colonial city. I look forward keenly to a very stimulating lecture and discussion on a very interesting topic. So now please welcome Dr. Kim with a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. It is a distinct honor to speak in front of you today. This is part of a research project that I began about 8 years ago, before I got hired at Yonsei University. And then since then, I haven't really been able to finish it. So I've actually not published this material anywhere except in German. But it's part of a long-term project of a book manuscript that I'd like to work on, the colonial city. And part of what I sort of want to explore with you today is the issue of coloniality. What makes the colonial city different from a modern city? And I try to explore that theme through the consumption, like people buying things, right? That's actually one way of seeing many, many different interesting interactions. So that's basically what I'm trying to achieve today. So let me go ahead and continue with present my talk today. So without question, the city is one of the hallmarks, of course, of the modern era. And urban spaces are where transformations of a kind of global modernity manifest themselves in their most distinct forms. Now, there are many studies that have traced the importance of modern cities like Paris, Berlin, and Shanghai. Yet few comparable works exist about Seoul, at least in the English language. Of course, there's many works available in Korean. Yet the history of Seoul stands apart from many urban centers because for 35 years, of course, it had been a city under colonial occupation. Thus, an examination of this colonial city can reveal a wealth of very interesting issues related to notions of the modern and the colonial. And so a myriad of questions emerge pertaining to colonial Seoul, but today I want to just focus on certain aspects of the everyday life of the residents, and how the gradual transformation of Seoul led its residents to redefine their urban spaces and collective identities. Now, colonial Seoul is a particularly important site for exploration because this was a location where the colonial subjects, Koreans, encountered both a colonial reality as well as a nascent capitalist modernity. So Koreans, of course, living in the countryside had often no idea of the changes taking place within Seoul. They could live their entire lives with little evidence that the Japanese were in Korea. However, it's the Korean residents of the capital city who were acutely aware of this transformation that took place and the shifting urban landscape would often influence their collective identities as colonized subjects. Now, Seoul at the beginning of the colonial period, as it had been during the Joseon dynasty, remained, of course, the political and cultural center of Korea. These are some images of what Seoul looked like before the colonial occupation. You can see Myeongdong Cathedral there, as well as, of course, Deoksugung, right, we're across from, and, of course, Independence Gate, and so on. Yet it was Japan's colonial conquest of Korea that engendered an extreme sense of defeat and anguish among the Koreans because of their subjugated fate. And this loss of sovereignty and the perceived gap between Korea and the West would provoke rather disconsolate views about the capital city. The negative views about the colonial capital persisted for about a decade of Japanese rule. I just picked out one sort of description of Seoul written in early 1920s. It reads, "Are there or are there not houses in those mountains? It's true that one receives this doubtful impression. Then when one enters the four gates and looks all around the four directions, there are deep mountains in the north, south, east, and west. Why build a city in such a location? Here our people already face embarrassment," unquote. To explain this quote, as you know, the city of Seoul was within the mountains. So when you come from the Han River, you used to see no buildings whatsoever, except for maybe a little moat or sort of little port kind of facilities. And so when you come into the city, many observers often noted how small the city looks after seeing some of the larger sort of cities that are around the world. But of course, there was one place where changes took place in a rather ominous form, and this was during the first decade of colonial rule when the Japanese began to settle Namsan Mountain. Ever since the late 19th century, the Japanese began to settle into the southern parts of the city, especially surrounding Namsan, and this location continued to expand during the early colonial period. Consequently, the city became divided into a Japanese southern district called Namcheon by the Koreans, and centered in an area known as Jingoge, or Honmachi by the Japanese, and the Korean northern district, which the Koreans call Bukchon, meaning the northern area, centered around the Jongno district. And so the Japanese constituted only a small percentage of the entire population of Korea, but they tended to congregate in urban areas where they had disproportionate influence on colonial urban life. In fact, if you go to the ports like Masan, Busan, sometimes they were predominantly Japanese in population. So it was in the urban areas where Japanese congregated, where they often formed very large sort of neighborhoods. And so while there's considerable discrepancy in the available statistics, Seoul had a population of about 240,000 in 1910. Some argue around 300,000. The numbers are not very precise. And this figure did not change very dramatically until the end of 1920s. But the Japanese population was about 25% of this entire total. So 1 out of 4 Seoul residents was a Japanese in the 1920s. Of course, later there'll be a lot more Koreans moving in and then the proportion will drop. But you can imagine that it was a fairly Japanized city in its own way. And of course, it was the completion of many modern buildings, colonial themed buildings, which began to really transform the city. Here we have images of the Seoul Station coming up, and of course the Oriental Development Company building. The city of Seoul began its major transformation into a Japanese city, right? And of course, one of the biggest symbols of this transformation was the Joseon Shrine, which went up Namsan Mountain. Of course, it's no longer there anymore, but it used to be one of the largest shrines within the Japanese Empire, actually. Of course, right here, this is what the Joseon Hotel used to look like in the 1920s and 30s. Before this building, it was a beautiful building actually, before it was torn down to build this hotel on this very site today. In any case, the Western style buildings constructed in the 1920s and 30s completely transformed the external appearance. And one of the most dramatic transformations, of course, took place with the 1929 exposition. This was sort of a trade fair to encourage colonial consumption. And they transformed the Gyeongbokgung Palace grounds into essentially an amusement park, where they they put up these sort of spiraling towers, and over several million people would visit this exposition grounds during the period. So it was sort of a hallmark of the transformation that the city went through during this era. Okay, and actually this is a cartoon that was published in the newspaper of the towers that you see back here. There, you can see that it's raining money, sort of showing the commercialism that was on display in this period. Because it was very obvious that this exposition was intended to try and encourage colonial consumption at a time when people had very little money to spend, right? Okay, and another sort of satire of the colonial exposition. This is a signboard because many of the buildings were covered with signs for the exposition. But you can see it's a kind of a it's a small little Korean house, and it has a big sign on it, so it's disproportionately large compared to the size of the building. Right? So there are many kinds of sort of these satires that were published during the period to sort of critique what was taking place during this exposition. Okay. Now, of course, one of the most dramatic transformations of the city involved the Governor General Building, which was built, of course, right in front of the Gyeongbok Palace. It's no longer there. It was removed back in the 1990s by the Kim Yonsei government. And it was one of the largest buildings that was built by the Japanese. In fact, it was the largest building in the Japanese Empire until they built the Imperial Diet Building in 1930. So for about a good 15 years or so, it was the largest building the Japanese built within their empire. And it was actually built with Chinese labor. Migrant Chinese would come in and they did most of the construction because they worked for even cheaper wages than Koreans during the period. And they used some of the best materials available. And you can see this was the hallway. And this dome was actually the largest dome within the Japanese Empire at the time too. So the Japanese went through extraordinary lengths to try and build this magnificent colonial construction. Of course, it had this sort of symbolic value, right? It was intended to show the power and majesty of the Japanese Empire to those who experienced this construction. Here's also, you can see it from the airborne view. So here's the palace, and this, of course, the Gwanghwamun area right here. And you can see there's the whole, and of course the palace is still there, so they had to remove the Gwanghwamun building actually. So the Gwanghwamun gate was removed and put aside over here, where it was then destroyed during the Korean War, and then was reconstructed back in front of the colonial building until this entire complex was removed and now restored to what it looks like today. If I had more time, I would love to go into the details of this, but I need to move on to other topics here. Okay, so the urban development led by the Japanese colonial authorities reinforced in the minds of the Korean residents that they now inhabited a Japanese city. One observer in the mid-1920s noted, quote, "The fact that we've become strangers, not owners, like swarms of pigeons intruding into a crow's nest, in not only Seoul but also in the countryside and the cities, is a fear that we have in common with both our friends in the countryside and those crowded in the cities," unquote. Thus, when we visit these changes, when these visible changes arrived in the 1920s, the Korean residents felt that they were no longer owners of their own city because it had become a Japanese city. And what proved to be just as clear a sign of the Japanese presence in colonial Korea was the flourishing commercial districts, the shopping centers that emerged within the city. The literary critic Kim Gi-jin wrote in the mid-1920s, quote, "I have been slapped. I have been slapped by the winds of the 12th year of Taisho. I have been slapped by the spirit of commercialism surrounding Namsan Mountain. The commercialism that slaps you wherever you go is enormous. My naively walking tears return from the corner of Jingoge after being slapped. I return helplessly. My naively walking tears that began its journey from the corner of Jongno returns after being slapped at Namsan Mountain." So you can see the image of being sort of slapped by this commercialism that they witness in this transformation here. The site of this conspicuous consumption and the commodities on display at the Japanese stores was, of course, a rude awakening to the Korean residents who were mostly excluded from this flourishing commerce found in the Japanese city. What's important to understand here is that the city had transformed so much, and this is what the Honmachi area looked like before the Japanese transformation. As one Seoul resident explained in 1929, therefore the name Jingoge was changed to Honmachi, and the traditional servants' houses besides the gate were replaced by 2 or 3 storied houses. The blue silk lanterns were replaced with 1,100 watt candle-powered electronic lamps, and the place was transformed into another world, like a city without nightfall. When you enter that location, you feel as if you left Korea for a trip to Japan. So you can imagine that a neighborhood that looked very Korean. In fact, this was where many of the servants used to live, outside the city walls. Because when the Japanese first arrived, they were not allowed into the city. And so they settled into the areas outside the city with very bad drainage and was not the nicest neighborhood. However, over the next 20, 30 years, they would transform this area into what looked like, this, right? Of course, this is where today the Shinsegae department store is located. This was a very famous plaza with neon signs, and the Bank of Korea, back then with the Chosun, Bank of Chosun, right, was located here. And so the name Jingoge, I'm sorry, it actually means muddy hills in the Korean language, right? Because this is where the Koreans or Japanese were first settled, was transformed into this modern space of shopping, and the Korean residents in Seoul could not help but be awed by the sight of a modern Japanese city that emerged from a previously sparsely inhabited region of the capital, and the lively cafes and luxurious department stores like Mitsukoshi that were a powerful attraction to Korean residents who craved the lifestyle of the modern city. Here's some more images of, so you can see right here where the Bank of Korea building is still located today. Of course, all these buildings have been replaced. This was a post office building right here, and then the industrial bank of Chosen located right here. And this is actually looking right from the Shinsegae department store. Of course, within the city, within the shopping district, we often see images of couples on dates going to the cafes and consuming, spending time within this modern area of the city. And the transformation really was quite apparent, right? So here's the Bank of Korea. This is the Joseon Hotel, right? And so this would be the Gwanghwamun Street right here. And so you can see that what I just showed you was this little corner here, where this entire area was transformed into this modern district. Okay. So the streets of the Southern District were filled with Koreans, modern boys and modern girls who appropriated the Japanese urban spaces to fulfill their own desires for commodity consumption and indulge in their fantasies of modern life. And so the Southern District was indeed a powerful magnet for colonial consumers who had this sort of urging for the capitalist spaces that could be found within the city. All the while, there is a tendency for capitalist spaces to mask the colonialism that is at the basis of this transformation. Many Korean travelers into the Southern District found themselves in a very unfamiliar environment where they did not feel very welcome. Koreans who could not speak Japanese nor could afford the luxury goods on display felt more like intruders than guests. There's a very satirical account of urban life published under an anonymous name in a magazine called Belganggon in 1929, which captures the sentiment of a Korean resident who felt very out of place in a department store. Quote, "We did not know how to behave, for it was our first time in a store where only the prominent people entered. The clerk said, quote, the Korean closet is upstairs." In other words, go upstairs. That's where the Koreans shop. Even without this direction, we felt we had to go to second floor since there were no Koreans on the first floor. There were Western suits, but we did not know any English, so we could not read anything. We could only stammer in Japanese, so it was difficult to ask questions. Therefore, just sniffing the fragrance of the cloth under our noses was like a song of a mad dance. The mysterious psychology of gathering in this far location, even though we can't speak, nor make any easy selection. Let's stop talking about this. Let's stop, unquote. So you can imagine a Korean shopper walking into this department store, can't speak Japanese, can't read the English, and so he only sniffs and smells the products on display because he can't really participate in this consumption. Yeah. So this mysterious psychology of traveling to a place where the Koreans did not feel very welcome, right, and could not speak the language, nor purchase anything, may perhaps be a powerful metaphor for the condition of the colonized living within the colonial modern city. Right? This is where we can discover the aspects of coloniality within this exterior of this transformation that's been taking place. And in some respects, this insatiable desire for commodities was no different in colonial Korea than any other society during the incipient stages of capitalism. We can ask the question, could many of the poor peasants living in terrace really afford to shop within the department stores, of course? Yet, one major difference within the colonial modern city was a sense of alienation from the consumption of others, because it was very clear that it was Japanese consuming these products, not so much the Koreans, which became defined along ethnic lines that reinforced the domination of the colonizers within the minds of the colonized. Thus, the colonial consumers in the early part of the colonial period congregated in urban spaces defined as Japanese, and the experience at times generated a sense of alienation. This is what I'm trying to pull out of the text that I read for you, how the Koreans felt so alienated from the modern splendors found within these Japanese districts. And the sense of collective exclusion from modern life that could only be experienced vicariously is evident in the ways that the residents of Seoul conceptualized their city. And in writings about colonial Seoul, there are often many direct comparisons made between the southern district, Namcheon, and Bukchon, the northern district. And clearly, this was a Japanese section of the city versus Korean. Many examples of this alienation also comes out in the commercials. Again, this is supposed to be a shop window where you can see what people are buying, but the exterior is very poor, right? So they have tiny little homes outside, and you see this big window with all the shopping going on. But most of the people live in these tiny little homes, and so you can see how they're trying to capture that. Throughout the early 1920s and 30s, this stark contrast led to many comparisons in the newspapers. They would often post pictures of how lonely Jongno, of course, is a Korean sector where very few people are shopping, and then put it right next to a picture of flourishing Jingoge, right? And so here's what the Japanese district looks like. Here's where we do our shopping, and so these are very common to see the two lined up together to show how the Koreans are being excluded from the consumption. And so the sight of Japanese colonizers consuming expensive luxury goods highlighted the sense of collective dispossession that had a rather strong symbolic impact. That was as great as the Governor General building that I first showed you, right? You can imagine, so on the one hand, you have this colonial architecture that stands as this magnificent symbol of Japanese power, and then this colonial consumption taking place that stands as another symbol of the changes. Now, what's interesting, though, is this sense of sharp division was, in fact, resulting from the uneven development of the city. This is what the Korean sectors of the city looked like. It didn't really change much in many parts of Seoul. There was poverty witnessed everywhere. The signs of Korean women doing laundry by Cheonggyecheon, which of course this is where Cheonggyecheon is located. Today is nice and neat, but it looked very different in the colonial period. Right? This is where the women did their laundry. The Korean neighborhoods. This is actually right here, the Dongrimun Gate. Oh, no, I'm sorry, the Seodaemun Gate over here. You can see how the changes was really stark, right? What the Korean sectors look like versus what the fancy modern buildings look like. So this is actually why the Korean speakers are so shocked by the changes. They're still living in the very poor part of the city in many cases, and they go into this completely foreign district. I think you're going to see something very similar, of course, in the uneven development that takes place in many parts of the world today, but it was particularly obvious in colonial Korea at the time. However, the changes do begin to take place, and so the cafes, which represent much of the colonial consumptions, began to spread, and you can start to find them in the northern parts of the city. And Jongno begins to undergo a major transformation by the 1920s and 30s. What used to be a rather sleepy and very sparsely populated part of the city grows into its own sort of commercial district. So by 1930s, Jongno becomes almost as developed as the southern district. And so you start to see a development taking place within what's considered the Korean districts of the city. Around mid-1930s is when much of this transformation place. And so you get to see modern girls and modern boys located in the northern part of the city. This then leads to numerous sort of observations of how the changes taking place. And so the cafes and tea rooms were followed by appearances of the Hwashin department store and the Donga department store that altered some of the shopping practices of young and fashionable dressed Koreans who used to congregate only in the southern districts. And so the appearance of department stores in northern district prompted one observer to point out, quote, "Happily the footsteps of the new bride of a modern family or the female student who enjoys extravagances are found less in the direction of Namdaemun or Southern Gate, and an opportunity has been presented to direct them towards the north," unquote. And thus the sight of these modern girls gathering in the northern district was interpreted as a sign that the Korean neighborhoods had finally begun to flourish commercially. And so it was the Hwashin department store that was a part of this emblematic change that signified the arrival of a commercial district to the Korean parts of the city. And so it was this department store, in a sense, where the Korean residents began to believe that the modern spaces for consumption that had been limited to the Japanese district was finally coming into their neighborhoods. And the sensation of traveling to a foreign world that could only be experienced in the Japanese districts finally began to appear at the heart of the Korean neighborhoods. One account from the 1930s observes, quote, "The restaurant in Hwashin is now selling naengmyeon and bibimbap. The ambition grows to have a clean late snack, delivered by a young smiling waitress at the 4th floor of the building. The only thing busy at night at Hwashin is the elevator to the restaurant, the department store with the most windows in Asia. Although the building has many windows, it has been constructed to not allow the wind in easily. From the outside, Hwashin looks like a cruise boat on the Mediterranean due to the thousands of windows," unquote. So you can see how this department store lit up at night would look like a kind of an exotic Mediterranean cruise ship. And so the shopping that takes place becomes satirized by the Koreans. These are Korean women walking in with their Korean clothes, but then they walk out dressed up fashionably, as you can see, sort of coming in, coming out. And this is, it says in Korean, "Asphalt 딸," the daughter of the asphalt, because she's sort of walking along the street. There's a cafe sign right here, and she's dressed very fashionably, sort of a sign emblematic of the new young woman there during the era. Of course, many other practices began to spread. Dancing in the cabaret sort of becomes actually it's outlawed. You're not supposed to be dancing in the cafes, but because you don't have dance halls, but they do dance, and so we have a lot of satirical comments. This is called 왕란의 bacteria, sort of the crazy bacteria that's infecting people, making them dance within these spaces. Okay, so the sense of delight in the increasing commerce of Jongno and the pride expressed over the construction of a modern department store in the 1930s must be viewed in light of the intense desire for modernity and a sense of colonial dispossession that was experienced by the Koreans in the 1920s. Yet this incipient capitalist transformation of Seoul did not resolve the fundamental problems of wealth disparity that existed between the colonizers and the colonized, between the different social classes between both groups. added to the complexities of urban life in the late 1930s was a kind of overcrowding problem from impoverished migrants who began to move into the city. And so before 1920s, here in Seoul, you did not have slums. But by the 1920s and 30s, you start to see shanty towns growing within the hills. And so you saw the poor neighborhoods, they're starting to grow. So it's more of the poor neighborhoods growing than the sort of developed parts of the city. So we actually see very uneven growth. But yet it's this sort of consumption that people like to focus on. So this is another image of a man with his girlfriend, I suppose, could be, and images of women working within the cafes, but they're passing through very poor neighborhoods. As you can see, these are little Korean homes, but they have their noses up and ignoring the poverty that exists all around them. So these contrasting images of the wealth next to the poverty is a repeating theme that can be found throughout the colonial period. And so as the metropolitan area reaches over 1 million people, the everyday realities of living in a crowded city began to bear on the minds of Seoul residents. And of course, once the war breaks out, the shelves of lavish colonial department stores become increasingly empty, and the war efforts disrupted the industrial production of the Japanese Empire. You start to see shortages, and so you're not able to consume these products on for sale. Thus, the city, which epitomizes and symbolizes this modern fantasy world, right? It's a world of leisure and luxury. It's a very contrasting, contradictory kind of urban space. And I suppose I don't have a real conclusion for you today, other than that I present you these images to get an idea of this capital city that had been the home of so many Japanese and Korean residents, and consider how the question of uneven development, right, the dual city, right, is very much something that's with us today. I think in Seoul today, we often forget how much of the inequalities that once existed, which actually up to maybe even just 10 years ago was so obvious in many parts of the city. And so I think this travel back into the colonial past might give you some opportunities to consider what the modern city today, looks like, and how that may affect the residents and the way they see themselves in relation to the city. So that's it for today in my presentation. Thank you very much. Should I have a lot? 1 meter?